Our speaker today, Annabelle Littoz-Monnet, is an associate professor in the Department of International Relations Political Science at the Graduate Institute, and she's also the co-director for the Global Governance Center at the Institute. Prior to joining, she was an assistant professor at the Central European University in Budapest. Prior to this, she had obtained her PhD from University of Oxford and then worked at the Social Legal Studies Center at Oxford and at the Royal Institute of International Relations in Brussels. Currently, her interests include global governance, the politics of knowledge, international organizations, bureaucratic expansion, and the concept of ethical expertise. And particularly on this, on ethical expertise, expert knowledge, she's edited a book. She's currently, she's finished another book that is under revision, and she's authored several papers. And also she's leading a project by the Swiss National Science Foundation on the use of ethics experts by bureaucrats and policymakers, which precisely speaks to the topic of the lunch briefing today. So the topic is ethics as a tool of scientific and technological governance, question mark. And question mark because we will see the discussion will shed light on the role of ethics experts and whether their presence in the discussion contributes to enlarge the debate on value-based policy issues, specifically on areas of scientific and technological innovations, or rather, whether this experts' authority, and precisely because of that, makes their involvement in the discussion a means to rather close the discussion, to make it a little bit more difficult, or to become a source of strategic resource for policymakers and bureaucrats in order to advance a particular agenda or policy. We will see. So before handing over, I will just remind everyone about the framework of this discussion. Professor Littoz-Monnet will speak for about 30 minutes, and then we will open the floor for questions and answers, and hopefully we will finish at 1:30 sharp. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Sophie and Diego, for the invitation today. So I'm going today to give you a glimpse of work which I have conducted as part of my book manuscript, which is currently under review, and writing several articles on the topic. So this is not presenting one specific chapter or one specific article, but I tried to give you an overview of various elements of my work here. So as mentioned, the project is funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation. That's how it is titled. There are already several publications which are out as part of this project. And the biggest piece, as I mentioned, is the manuscript Governing Through Ethics, the Production and Mobilization of Bioethical Expertise, which hopefully will be soon published. So let me just start with a quick introduction. What's bioethics? So, I mean, the two terms are used, ethics, bioethics. When you hear about these ethics commissions, sometimes they are called bioethics commissions, sometimes they are called ethics commissions. So the two terms are used interchangeably. What I am really talking about here is bioethics. But what is bioethics? It's actually a term which is still fairly recent. It dates from the 1970s, at least it was established in the 1970s. It refers, broadly speaking, to the examination of controversial ethics brought about by advances in life sciences or new technological and scientific developments. Many examples: embryo research, cloning, nanomedicine, synthetic biology, etc. So initially, bioethics was very much about these topics considered as typical bioethical topics concerning the beginning of life, for example, or the end of life. So embryo research, abortion, like typically these were the initial topics tackled through the lens of bioethics. Today, it's really very much about all sorts of issues, technological developments. I mentioned synthetic biology, also data privacy. There are opinions from various ethics groups, ethics commissions on data privacy issues. Here you see an article from Le Monde. This was after a very recent opinion from the French Ethics Commission, was issued in 2018, and this was about how France treats the elderly, comment la France maltraite ses vieux. So here the opinion was not about ending life and what's allowed, what's not, and so on. It was very simply about how the elderly are treated, what houses for the elderly look like, and so on. So this was a very broad societal issue, very broad societal questions tackled through the lens of ethics and bioethics. So what you can see here, just in a nutshell, is that it's rather broadening the remit of bioethics and the remit of these experts, call themselves expert bioethicists. They seem to look into a broader and broader range of issues. Here is a small machine. So let me a little bit go back into history. I mentioned just earlier on that bioethics was a fairly recent term. And I would like to give you a little bit of a glimpse of where it comes from, the term itself, but also bioethics as a new discipline and as a new field of expertise. As I said, it hasn't always existed. And actually, the birth of bioethics takes us to the 1970s in the US. Of course, European developments, I won't have the time to deal with how bioethics erode in every country, but they essentially caught up with developments in the US about 10 years later. So the first bioethics commissions were given birth in the US in the 70s, and then in the 1980s, most European countries started to have their own. So there were like a few events that were particularly destabilizing. So before bioethics existed, before this new cast of expert bioethicists existed, who was looking into such questions? Well, doctors, scientists, right? When doctors and scientists had to make decisions on what to do with their patients, or when scientists were conducting research on something very innovative, and when there was not already a kind of framework in place to regulate what kind of research they could conduct, how to regulate risks, and so on, they were the ones making decisions. There was no kind of external oversight, right? So this was very much the framework which was in place until the 1970s. And then there were several events which destabilized this framework. The first event, so to say, was the first successful heart transplant. It was conducted by Dr. Christian Barnard. He was actually from South Africa, and this was a highly mediatized event, a very attractive doctor who enjoyed being in the media, in the front page of the media, and this really broke the news. But of course, all sorts of ethical issues arose in that context, because when you talk about heart transplants, well, then you think about where to find hearts, right? Where to find these organs. I mean, that's for any kind of organ transplantation. And then there was a group within Harvard University, a group of scientists and doctors, physicians essentially, who looked at that, and they tried to define criteria for deaths, for brain deaths. And they were thinking, and they established new criteria. And this report also provoked a very mediatized debate. So aren't physicians just trying to make organs available so that they can conduct these transplants? How can we define whether someone is dead or not? What are the right criteria, and so on? So that was the first very highly mediatized debate. And then there was a second very highly mediatized debate in the 1970s. I don't know whether some of you have ever heard of the Tuskegee experiments. So these were experiments conducted in the US for actually 40 years, between the 1930s and the 1970s. These experiments were conducted by a team of doctors funded by the National Health Service. And what they were observing was the effect of untreated syphilis. And they decided to observe that on a group of black men, underprivileged black men. So of course, when they started the experiment, there was no medicine to treat syphilis, so the argument was that they were just conducting a natural experiment. But in 1945, penicillin was invented, and they continued the experiment. They didn't give the medicine to these people. And then the argument was that, well, it would be a pity to stop it because we are so far away already. And so they justified it with themselves, with all sorts of arguments. And then a whistleblower from inside the profession, actually, this was a physician, Bleacher was his name, published an article on that in the early 70s. This broke the news. As you can see, the New York Times just took the issue, and of course, at a time when racial discrimination had already become a mediatized topic, this created scandal, right? And there was really a requirement from the media, from the public, from some politicians who were active on the issue to do something. Like, we cannot just let scientists decide themselves what's ethical or not and what kind of research they can conduct, and we need to have some kind of principles. And then there was a third destabilizing event, the gene slicing experiments. So this was also in the 1970s. There were the first experiments on DNA and gene slicing, which were conducted. Like, so the idea was very much how to take genetic material into another genome. But then, of course, the way this was conducted, so I'm not super good with the scientific side of things, but I know that the way it was conducted was through viruses. So viruses can conduct genetic material from one organism to another genome. And of course, there were risks involved with the use of these viruses in the lab. And scientists themselves who were conducted these experiments were like, oh, we cannot just go on with that without any kind of framework. There was a debate within the profession with those who just wanted to like push the research. It's too interesting to, you know, be stopped by any kind of regulation or framework. And those who were like, well, there are risks, so we have to do something. And then there were conferences, scientists' conferences in 1975 and 1976, and they were trying to think about a way of regulating themselves. So that was first the response of scientists. Let's regulate these type of experiments or other scientific experiments ourselves so that there's no external oversight. So this was the first attempt at self-regulation. So, but of course, this was also discussed in the news. So these three events, they very much destabilized the established idea that scientists essentially could decide, right, on what they were doing and on these sensitive questions. Here you can see Senator Walter Mondale, a Democrat senator in the US. I mention him because he was one of those politicians who actually wanted to do something and impose some kind of oversight on scientists. He held some hearings in the US Senate in the year 1968. And I looked a little bit at these debates and what scientists who were called on to also testimony during these hearings were saying. And I have two interesting quotes which show the reluctance of scientists to have any kind of oversight on their work. So here you have a medical professor testifying before the Mondale committee saying, oh, if you are thinking of theologians, lawyers, philosophers, and others to give some direction, I cannot see how this would help. The fellow who holds the apple can peel it best. And then another citation from a surgeon who was also speaking before the Mondale committee. There are areas in the development of medicine where a certain amount of boldness is necessary for success. I am not sure that committees have established a reputation for courage and boldness. The proposal from Mondale was indeed to have a kind of committee regulating scientific activities. There was strong resistance to that from most scientists, from the majority of scientists. They were afraid that this would slow down scientific research. I argue that the creation of the first bioethics commission which was a presidential commission on bioethics in the US, created in the late 1970s, was the outcome of this conjunction of forces. So on the one hand, you had public protests, activism of a small group of politicians, you saw Mondale, a critique from the part of theologians. Of course, they always had a strong voice in the field of bioethics, and they were quite critical of various practices. And then on the other hand, you had scientists who were very resistant to any kind of external oversight on their activities. And then I argue that bioethics, in the form of a new field of expertise, which will fill in these bioethics commissions or bioethics committees, depending on how they are called in most Western countries, is the compromise that was reached. Not a regulatory, not a binding form of regulation on scientist activities, but some form of external oversight, right? So today, bioethics is a new field. It's a new discipline. Departments were created from the late 1970s on in universities, very often within the discipline of medicine, which is relevant. It will also explain why it developed as a friendly force towards science and medicine. Today, there are also departments outside of medical schools, but initially it was very much how it developed. It has journals, it has international associations. What makes for a discipline is really all that, having departments, units, journals, associations, and so on. Center for Bioethics at Harvard, and there are bioethics committees in most countries. I just took two logos which I could find online, the Italian Bioethics Commission and the US one, but all Western countries have bioethics committees. Developing countries are also starting to have their own bioethics commissions, a policy which is very much pushed by the UNESCO, which no time to explain here why, but is also very active in the field of bioethics and actually pushes for the development of these commissions. You can see here UNESCO chair in bioethics in Haifa. So the UNESCO even funds chairs in bioethics in various places. I think it has 6 in the world. So it's a new field of expertise. It's a new discipline. It's a new field of expertise. There's high public demand for this type of expertise because of the creation of all these bioethics commissions. So there's some kind of interdependency between bioethics as a new academic discipline which tried to gain its autonomy and public demand for that type of expertise. That developed very much in, thank you for alerting me to the time, in interaction with one another. So, what can we say about bioethics as a new field of expertise? Well, we can say that it indeed pushed aside the remit of scientist jurisdiction. They were seen as too enmeshed with their own activities to be able to take the right decisions. But it also delegitimized other voices to have a claim on such matters. The claim of citizens. Citizens should also be able to participate to deciding on new normative frameworks for new scientific and technological developments, at least in my opinion. There should be broader debates on these issues, and they were seen as lacking the expertise. So we have to create a new cast of experts to decide on these matters. And of course, theologians who were also claiming, who were fighting to maintain some kind of authority, jurisdiction on these issues, but then, of course, the word was that they can only talk in the name of religion. So we need to have some kind of neutral experts in bioethics, right? Of course, this has consequences. This new cast of experts in ethics or bioethics has unique attributes. It has a greater aura of diversity reflexivity, because usually these ethics commissions are composed of philosophers, lawyers, scientists of different kinds. So there is more diversity. However, all these people are there as experts. They are sitting there as holders of very specialist knowledge. That's what their authority and legitimacy relies upon. They are in no way representing civil society, different groups of the civil society. So what we can say is that what this means is that we have an expertization of ethics. This idea that experts, people who hold specialized systematic knowledge in ethics, and indeed they have degrees in bioethics or ethics of some kind, so they read these literatures, but there's this idea that experts can decide, that these issues are not so much about societal debates and so on, but about experts being able to tell what's the best decision in a neutral way. So now I would like to give you a short glimpse of some cases I looked into in the book. Very quick snapshots. I have 2 big chapters on these 2 cases, but to give you an idea of how these expert bioethicists are mobilized and for what purpose in practice. So the first case is a case of EU nanotechnology policy. So one of my chapters looks at how the European group of ethics, a group of bioethicists sitting in Brussels, was mobilized by the European Commission. So in the mid-1990s, the European Commission wanted to push the development of research on nanotechnology. The US had already done so. There was this big idea to catch up because the US was investing like crazy. So the European Commission wanted to do the same. It very much framed nanotechnologies as a revolutionary source of progress. I am quoting a European Commission document: "Nanotechnologies will eradicate poverty, hunger, and drudgery." All together, all at once. So that's very much how it was portrayed at the time. But of course, there were concerns from some environmental NGOs, so typically Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace, always the ones reacting. And they raised some concerns about the capability of nanoparticles to penetrate the blood-brain barrier, and the risks of exposure to nanomaterials, especially for workers who work with them. So they say, well, we need nano-specific regulations, because this type of material, they cannot be regulated like the others. It's a new type of material, and existing tests are not sufficient to test their toxicity and the risks for both health and environment. So there was already an emerging conflict, but it was not a very broad conflict. It was only a couple of NGOs and the Greens within the European Parliament who started to protest. And the European Commission decided to request an opinion from the European Group of Ethics in that specific context. Essentially, what I observe in the book is that ethics experts who were consulted essentially supported the Commission's position, which was that there was no need for a nano-specific regulation, so the existing framework was sufficient. And what I observe also is that although the European Commission advertised an integrated and anticipatory approach, which was meant to be more inclusive of different voices and so on. In fact, what it did is that it essentially expanded the debate by including the ethics experts, but that it actually allowed it to close the debate to the broader public by making the claim that this was ethically fine, right? The ethics experts have been consulted on the topic, and we don't really need to go any further. So I argue that actually consulting these experts was a successful tool to preempt conflict. Here I have a citation, sorry, I forgot to write the date, but this was in 2015, of an EU official whom I interviewed. All civil society responses were anticipated, and we jumped the gun to incorporate public concerns first, not to counter them, but to preempt and incorporate them. So there was very much, and of course this happened after the GMO controversy, which was seen by the European Commission as a huge communication failure. We haven't explained it well enough to the public. That's why there were protests. And so now we're going to develop this kind of strategy. But in fact, the strategy is not as participatory and integrated as it says. It's mainly consisted in including these ethics experts. So I argue that it served as a way of closing the debate rather than opening it up. Nano products are commercialized. There are actually the tests, all tests say that we do not know sufficiently about the risks. They are commercialized. You can look in your toothpaste. Dioxide de titane is like in most toothpaste, and it is a nano product. It's not advertised, but look for it. It's going to be forbidden soon, this product, but it's still there, and it was commercialized without proper knowledge. It's also in candies, kids' candies. There are nanoparticles in there. They use it in various forms, but in toothpaste, it's in a whitening agent, an agent that just makes the toothpaste whiter. That's what it's used for. So look into it, dioxide de titane, and you will see that I am not just making this up. So another case, I still have 5 minutes, yes, wonderful. Another very quick case which I looked into, this was the case of synthetic biology in the US. So this was a more recent consultation of expert bioethicists in the US. So this was under Barack Obama. He very much wanted to push for synthetic biology research. This was indeed part of his plan to develop biofuels and develop US oil independency. This was a claim a statement which he made in his 2011 State of the Union speech. So synthetic biology can be used for the production of biofuels, so this was a clear application. So he very much wanted to push for further research in the field. Again, opposition from the Greens, Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace, both say, well, we don't know enough about synthetic biology, what risks it could entail. We want a moratorium until further research and a proper regulatory framework is established. And they voiced these concerns to President Obama and to the relevant ministries in various letters. Again, a similar strategy as with the European Commission. Barack Obama asked the US ethics experts group, it's called the Presidential Commission on Ethics, to ensure that he asks them for an opinion. The way he phrases, I looked at his letter to the US Bioethics Commission, you can find it, and the way he phrased the request was that he asked them for suggestions to ensure that the US reaps the benefits of the developing field of synthetic biology within appropriate ethical boundaries. There's already a specific framing of the question, right? I mean, when you think about how independent these experts are, of course, what they say may also depend on the question which is being asked. So I think here the suggestion was very much to look into the benefits of this field. So what do? The US bioethicists? Well, they write a report, as they were asked to do. And in this report, they call for prudent vigilance in the field of synthetic biology. They do not suggest any regulatory constraints. This concept of prudent vigilance very much acted as a kind of conciliating rhetoric between the two camps, those who didn't want research, those who wanted such research because it would have useful applications. It has no legal precedent. This concept of prudent vigilance was very harshly criticized by green NGOs because they said, well, what is this? It has no legal consequences to request prudent vigilance. There are no regulatory constraints. So it was a rhetoric which could be mobilized by the executive to actually push the case for research in the field. So I argue that by involving ethics experts into policy, Obama was able to, yes, to make the case that synthetic biology research is conducted within ethical boundaries. His agenda became less contestable, and there was no expansion of the conflict. Only green NGOs were vocal about it, but there was no public debate on that. So here I'm not, trying to be normative in terms of whether we should push such or such technologies. I'm not a scientist, and I'm not even able to capture all the possible applications which these technologies would create. I find it problematic that there's no debate, no societal debate on these issues, and that only experts are consulted. So just a couple of words of conclusions. Ethics experts, I argue, essentially act as a tool or an instrument to maneuver through potential or existing policy conflicts in the field of science and technological developments. I mean, these are fields where you often have controversies. When there's a new scientific and technological development, of course, it's in the nature of things that there's no framework yet because it's new, so we need to decide on how to proceed, how to do research, whether we can do research or not, whether the applications can be commercialized or not. So, of course, these are issues which easily lead to conflict. And having ethics experts available, I argue, allow policymakers who rather want to push for such developments to maneuver through these conflicts, either preempt them or tame them when they have already arose. And of course, I argue that ethical expertise is a very effective tool to do that because they have this kind of democratic aura. The claim can be made that they are very diverse, very interdisciplinary, and altogether democratic. That's the discourse. I don't see how democratic they are because they are experts appointed by policymakers, either by the executive or sometimes the parliament also has a voice and so on. In the cases I have observed, ethics experts essentially made policy possible rather than provided any kind of oversight on it. I'm open that there might be cases where in which it will work differently, but for those which I have looked at, this is how it functions. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Annabelle, for this presentation. We're going to open now the floor for discussion. So if you want to participate, please raise your hand, and we will bring the microphone to you. And please state your name and your affiliation.
Hello, can you hear me? Hi, I'm Judith Dematigoda, and I'm visiting with my colleagues from the Zukunfts colleague in the University of Constance. So I just wanted to ask a question to clarify your thesis to some extent. Do you believe that if there is a kind of panel of bioethics experts, it should be reflective of more diverse disciplinary or more kind of reflective of civil society? Or do you think, I'm not entirely sure what the kind of thesis was, basically.
Okay. Can you take some questions?
Yeah, because we have more microphones.
Thank you.
Later here.
Hi, I'm Severin. I'm a student here at the Graduate Institute. And I wonder more about the computer science field as well with the AI and having more and more ethical research, or try and have this ethical debate. And we saw Google had an ethical committee they put up, and that already was shut down right now. I mean, a week ago or something like that. And I wonder if the push for a private company is the same, to kind of say, okay, it is dealt with, or if there is another motivation for that. Thanks.
Okay.
Can you repeat the question, because I couldn't hear anything either.
I will try. So the first question was asking, so you think these ethics groups should be more diverse, but how, in what way? I wasn't thinking in terms of adding any new disciplines. They are pretty interdisciplinary. There's a different blend in different countries of disciplines, and that also changes depending on the new topics which arise, like computer specialists have been appointed, for example, for new development. This wasn't the case 6 or 8 years ago. I was indeed thinking in terms of involving civil society representatives. I'm aware that this is not an ideal solution either, that there will be some politics about which groups to include, which groups not to include, and then we can write about the politics of participation. But I think we need to get started in this direction. I don't think that experts alone can decide on these issues. And second question, you wanted to follow up on your question? Yes?
So I mean, I'm British, unfortunately. The main thing with that kind of notion, I think, is perhaps the idea. I think it was one of these cretins like Michael Gove said, we've had enough of experts, right? But in certain respects, you kind of need experts, right? And you would agree that there is a requirement for experts in certain fields. And by your own admission, you don't really understand the science and some of the topics which you've researched for a book, for example, right? So what is the utility of bringing in civil society or religious groups into a scientific discourse, which is inherently complex?
Yes, I think that there is a room for experts too. You are right. Some of these issues are extremely complex, but I don't think it's only about science, it's also about values. And then citizens also can have informed opinions on what values they think should act as a framework for the development of scientific and technological developments. I don't think you need to understand all the technical aspects to have an idea of what science and what technologies you would like to see or not. But yeah, that's my argument. Second question was, yes, the Google committee, yes, we were talking about it just before the talk started. And yes, I think it was about the people who were appointed in this group. In general, I mean, your question about why would private companies appoint ethics committees, I haven't looked into that yet, but that's actually an excellent question, maybe for a future paper. I suspect that it is also a way of saying it has been dealt with and it's been checked by our ethics committee. I mean, I don't necessarily refuse the idea that sometimes they really want to think about these issues, and then it might be useful to have some people in the company to really think about the ethical implications of, so it might be a combination of both, like we want to know. There's always this concern from the part of private actors, like public policy makers, that they don't want things to fire back, right? So we may better think about the risks, ethical risks or consequences early on, so that there won't be a massive protest later on. So I think that, yeah, that might be a concern, yeah.
Thank you very much. Daphne Gönenç. I recently finished my PhD in political science here. I wonder, Professor, if you can give us an example of research that a bioethics committee actually banned because it was too risky, and another example of a research that was not banned, but it created a lot of debate. within the committee? Just to clarify, just to give us an example of how the committees work a little bit more.
Hi, Michal from the Graduate Institute. I think it was in 2015, I'm not sure of the date, that Switzerland actually held a referendum on, I'm not exactly sure of the scientific terms, about the legality of testing embryos before reimplanting them. I think that was the question, if I'm not mistaken. So just to use that as an example of when civil society is widely questioned and has the ability to actually make a decision about bioethics. So I'm just curious to know what your opinion is about that model. We also know now, what we didn't know then, that referenda can go wrong. And that sometimes you have to be very careful about how you phrase them and what information the public is actually in possession of when it actually is asked to vote. So it can really go in all directions. So curious to know what your opinion is about the role of civil society in that way.
Yes. Research that was banned. I mean, well, first of all, these ethics groups have a consultory role, so they are not in a position to ban something. They can recommend against. So, of course, and these opinions matter, right? Because it would be difficult for a government, for a ministry to just push for research after a super negative opinion of such a group. I cannot think, there must be examples, I just cannot think of one. I mean, as I said, usually it's more supportive of scientific and technological developments, but I'm sure that there are instances. I would have to look into that. Yes, and another example you were asking, so research that was not banned and which then created a big debate. Yeah, you see, that's the thing, that actually I also cannot think of a good example which would tend to confirm my argument that these ethics groups are consulted more to close debates than to open them. I mean, there was a huge debate at the time, but it's already an old debate on cloning, for example, and that's something which clearly was banned, but there was agreement both from policymakers and from ethics experts, from everyone. There was a kind of consensus that this is a red line, like we're not going to do cloning, right? Or so, yes, I can't think of an example. I can think of some technologies which have been banned, but I cannot think of an example where an ethics group was consulted and suggested to not ban it, and then it was a huge topic of debate. But I can think about this further. About the role of civil society, yes, you are right. Referendums, the outcome of referenda can be very conservative. It might be too demanding for ordinary citizens like us to come up with opinions about all these matters. And of course, there's the framing, how the question is asked can be problematic, and sometimes in Switzerland there's even a recommendation which is given by the Conseil Fédéral, which I think is highly problematic because it influences the vote. So these are issues I'm aware of. I'm not necessarily saying that all these questions have to be submitted to a vote. I'm saying that we would need to have some representatives, some informed representatives of different civil society groups included. And I can give several examples, like, for example, nanotechnologies, which I tackled. So nanomaterials are supposed to be very risky for workers, for example. They may be risky, we don't know exactly yet, for consumers. They were never represented. Not a single representative of a consumers group or of workers working with nano products in the field of nanotechnology. So for me, these would be two groups who would need to be represented, for example, in that field. yeah, but I agree with you. I mean, the framing of the question, I mean, these are issues. And of course, there's a huge literature on how civil society can also be manipulated. And yes, so we would have to be careful about that. But at least opening access, yes, would be great.
My question will duplicate the previous ones because I have very bad hearing, so I don't really know what the other ones ask. I am a most unethical person, and I come and attend this kind of talk just to know what ethical people think so that I can act just the opposite. Especially since I could never understand the difference, or at least the added value of the concept of ethics as compared to the law. Because consensual ethics, if we agree on ethics, it is what we call in common language the law. If there is a difference between both concepts, it means that true ethics will always be an ethical dilemma, that is, will always be contrarian, and you have to pay by being the only one to suffer with your ethics against the majority. But it is the first time, I must admit, that I heard someone trying to elucidate that paradox, because when you explain how both groups were discarded, the citizens because the incompetent citizen and the partisan experts, you gave an answer to this paradox, and I thank you for that. But if I understood your conclusion, I totally disagree with your conclusion that the expertization of ethics has withdrawn the debate from the public at large and restricted it again among the elite, because every day I have to suffer the ethical claims of all kinds of NGOs, political groups, etc., wherever I go, and it goes as far as even commercial, boutique add ethic. You don't have any more dietetic spelled the right way. You always have it with an H. So it's a daily occurrence in every street, in every second. So I would say that both sides, the experts and the public at large, are using and abusing the concept of ethics as far as I can observe. I don't know, maybe you have another perception.
Thanks so much for your talk. You mentioned that the destabilizing events of the 1970s led to this idea that scientists alone cannot decide what to do on these sensitive issues. Looking at your research on UNESCO, you document how most of the members of that bioethics committee were not just experts, but scientists. And so my question is, how do you connect this demand for bioethics with the supply of these committees, which are filled with mostly scientists?
Should I answer? Yes, thanks for these questions. So, yes, you had some comments. Thanks for the comments about the connection between law and ethics. You are right. Of course, not everything is regulated. So this debate, not everything is regulated by law. I mean, for these new scientific and technological developments, that's a problem, that there is no normative and regulatory framework. That's why there's a potential debate on them. About your second point, that ethics is mobilized everywhere. You're right. You're right. NGOs, yes, talk about the ethics of this or that such actions are unethical. Governments talk about ethical wars to also justify wars and so on. So ethics is everywhere. I mean, we talk about ethics all the time within universities and what kind of research is ethical or not. So you are right. And I think that when ethics is mobilized by NGOs, for example, since you mentioned, it's also a way of depoliticizing a question. So, right? If you
they lost the political battle. When they lose the battle, political battle, they want to use ethics to force their view.
Yeah, because ethics seems to be something more universal and contestable. If an action is unethical, well, then that's clear. We're not going to support that. You should not support that. Whereas if it's a political debate, then there are pros and cons, and that's different. So of course, it's always stronger to make the ethical argument. So in a way, it doesn't contradict what I was saying, although you were talking about the political mobilization of ethics, but in both cases, in the case of ethics commissions, which I examined, it's a way to depoliticize debates because it keeps debates very closed, examined by the experts. And when ethics is mobilized by civil society organizations, it's also a way of depoliticizing the issue, right? So I think you can see at least a similar, you can make that parallel at least on that level. Then about, yes, my UNESCO article, indeed, so I assume that few people in the room have read it, but in this article I talk about how the UNESCO invested the field of bioethics in the late 1980s when no international organization had ever invested this domain, so it acted very much as a first mover. And because there was absolutely no one knowing much about bioethics within the organization, it was very much an idea of the Director General at the time to push for action in the field. Well, they actually needed some people who were able to do something, to draft declarations in the field and so on. And then they set up a high-profile expert group. You are right. And this high-profile expert group was composed very predominantly of scientists, in different sub-disciplines, but these were scientists. So I don't think they were philosophers. I think there were a few scientists who also had a training in ethics, like who had worked like applied ethics. Like, so why? I think this specific blend of people, it cannot be generalized to other groups. This was very much what the UNESCO decided to do. But it reflects two things that, to some extent, bioethics is indeed developing, and especially at the time had been developing essentially within the field of medicine. It had not yet really gained its kind of autonomy. So often these were like doctors who had also written on some ethical issues, for example, right? So philosophers were trying to fight a bit to have their place. Still, actually, also few philosophers were interested in what they called applied ethics. You know, this was kind of looked down in philosophy departments at the time. So it took some time before they got into these questions. I mean, philosophers are interested in ethics, like broadly speaking, fundamental principles and how we should act and so on. But like in terms of applied ethics, applied to science, and they were not very much into that either, right? So it was also about the expertise that was available, and it mainly came from the field. It has diversified since then, but this was very much, there.
Okay, thank you. So one thing I wanted to put emphasis on perhaps here, because one of the questions was more about scientific expertise, and I think what's very interesting about your research about ethical expertise, which within democratic theory, it doesn't exist. I mean, there's no moral expert. That's what Robert Dahl, for instance, has been writing about. But what I wanted to ask, ethics, the way in which you conceive of ethics, some people conceive of it as non-cognitivists, like thinking like morals are emotions or morals are encoded in our DNA. Morals are an expression of what's encoded in our DNA. So if you have something like an ethics committee, you already presuppose that ethics is something you can discuss about, something about knowledge. Because if you consider it as morals being emotions, then it's even more problematic, because then you should have a democratically represented ethics committee, otherwise you're just imposing your particular ethics on the rest. So is that an aspect you discuss in your book, the way how ethics being conceived can be conceived differently, sometimes discussed as meta-ethics? I don't know.
Hi. Are you optimistic that ethics committees will actually be used ethically, as opposed to just be used to legitimize political agendas that exist, outside of the committees? And do you think that adding representatives from the public to the ethics committees might just be risky by increasing their legitimacy and therefore increasing their ability to shut down discussion and to act in a very unethical way, just enabling political actors?
Okay. Yes, thanks. Thanks for your insight on ethics and emotions. I don't address that in the book because I haven't thought about it, but it's a great point. I do address the point that ethics, of course, can be conceived in different ways. There are different doctrines, different sources for ethics and what's ethical or not. And I do criticize the current discourse which is held by most of these ethics commissions, that essentially they rely on a very utilitarian framework. They rely on a doctrine of bioethics which essentially aims at diminishing risks and maximizing benefits. That's how problems are portrayed. So it's not so much in terms of what's right and what's wrong, but it's more in terms of costs and benefits. And of course, they portray problems through that lens because it allows them to make the case that they rely on kind of universal set of principles, which are objective, which are not the principles of certain groups, right? So, and it allowed, of course, bioethicists to differentiate themselves from theologians who are defending the values of specific religious groups. So, of course, they didn't want to go towards that path. But then they also make the claim that they rely on universal, objective set of principles. And this I do criticize it in the book because I don't think you can think in such terms, especially when it comes to... I may agree with the claims that some ethical principles are universal when you think about freedom. I would personally agree that all humans want more freedom, and that might be an ethical principle towards which we should aim, or freedom of speech, or like different forms of freedom. When it comes to technological and scientific developments, I don't think that there's anything like an objective and universal discourse about them, and therefore it would be better to acknowledge that it's about values. And when it's about values, that's why I encourage a more societal discourse. Then these things should be decided by consensus, through societal debates. So but thanks for your comment on emotions. That's something I could still add on since it's not published yet. What was the next question? Yes, am I optimistic? Gosh. I do think that through the incorporation of civil society representatives, if we go quite broadly about which representatives are included, this would definitely go in the right direction. Now, of course, I am aware that, as it was said earlier on, civil society can be manipulated. There's a question of who has a voice, who doesn't. Would it be used to legitimize, even to a greater extent, decisions made by making the claim that, oh yes, Friends of the Earth was at the table and even they agreed, or, well, that's possible. That's possible, but I don't see really a better way forward.
Yeah. But I'm not extremely optimistic in general, because I think that then there's also the role of private actors, right, who, when it comes to scientific and technological developments, and then I think there's also another critique to be made about their influence in such processes, and they participate, they work hand in hand with policymakers in all cases I have examined. So that's another problem. So if civil society representatives would also work hand in hand with policymakers, whether it is through this ethics group or directly through other meetings or forums or conferences which they organize, I think this would already be going in the right direction.
We have one last question.
I hate this is the last question because I think you may have addressed this in answer to a previous question, is my thought. But you began, interestingly, by defining bioethics as the examination of, quote, controversial ethics. And then you propose around this expertise. And those who study ethics find they fall into defined camps. There's either theistic, non-theistic, there's utilitarians, there's Kantians, there's even modern theories of ethics are the justifications we spend in confirming our own intuitions, that our processes, our primal processes are built into. And so that if you have, the question really centers around reliance on an expertise, meaning someone who is simply trained to ask questions, because there is no universally agreed principles of ethics under which these things would be applied. So largely, and I'll pose this then as a question, is the result in your examination come from who it is you ask the question of? If you have your panel of experts populated by people who hold certain views, that's going to lead largely to a certain conclusion. Change the constituency, you'll change the answer. And so is the expertise a false sense of security we have in dealing with these issues?
That's my last question, yes. Thanks for your question. You are right that there are very different views and nothing is settled. And yes, I think that's a way to look at the field of bioethics. It's a way of asking questions. I mean, I could say the same about my field, right? I don't know all the answers, but I know how to ask questions, hopefully. Yet, the problem which, well, you have identified through your question is that those bioethicists who are consulted essentially adhere to one set of principles or one doctrine. Principalism is very dominant in the field, and when bioethics went global, when it started to be mobilized also by international organizations and also bioethics committees at the domestic level, then this was the doctrine that was the most heavily represented. So that may explain why there's no real and genuine debate within these groups. And also when there are debates, usually they are not very much presented to the outside, right? I mean, what we see is the final report, which makes it look like everyone was in agreement. So that's, we kind of miss on these conflicts, if there are some. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We went over a little bit, but thank you very much for coming, for participating, and we look forward to seeing you some other day. Please join me in thanking Professor Littoz-Monnet for this presentation. Thank you.